Hello fellow creature, welcome back to Rooftop Talks. I want to reaffirm once again what veganism is, and the way I'm thinking of this is kind of like doing housekeeping for the vegan movement. What I can see is that the vegan movement needs a lot of housekeeping right now. It's a really messy space. There's a lot of misconceptions for what veganism is, and you know what happens when we are not clear amongst ourselves about what veganism actually is? The public, the non-vegan public, is also confused about what veganism is. And that's where all of these straw man attacks come from. If you're a long-time subscriber, you might have noticed that my videos have kind of changed. Like, I'm doing a lot more of these rooftop talks, and I'm not really posting any more these outreach videos. Even though I am sitting on a huge pile of outreach videos, I realized that non-vegans were dictating the course of the conversation. Non-vegans were constantly bringing up food and diet when veganism isn't about food and diet. They were controlling where the conversation went, and I was constantly on the back foot following the topics that they wanted to talk about, which was in turn dictated by the topics they thought veganism was about. And so instead, I wanted to have this more proactive approach where I got to decide, like with these rooftop talks, I got to call the shots in terms of what I felt was important to establish. A lot of vegans are always on the back foot, and they're always fielding questions from ignorant non-vegans. It gets so bad to where even vegans, prominent vegans in the vegan community, don't seem to understand what veganism is. I'm not going to name names here, and I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping in this video to establish what veganism is and what veganism isn't. And when the topic turns to something that veganism isn't, we can meet people where they're at to an extent. Like, we can satisfy people's concerns and questions and curiosities, but we should always do it with this little additional note of like, by the way, what you're talking about here is not veganism. And before you say, well, how come you get to decide what is and is not veganism? Well, I'm going by the original definition of veganism, which was established in the 1950s, which predates these other whack definitions of veganism that other people are going by. So the thing is, if your interpretation of veganism is principally opposed to the original definition of veganism and came after original veganism, you need to get your own word. They put the flag in the sand first, right? There's nothing stopping you from forming your own community around a different value system. Just don't call it veganism because you're being untruthful. And until people start to respect that, I will most likely have to refer to this as original veganism. The kind of Leslie Cross brand of veganism, which is about ending the exploitation of animals at the hands of man. Mankind ending their exploitation of animals in all forms, in painful forms of exploitation and potentially non-painful forms of exploitation. All forms of exploitation. Do not use animals for your own gain. So I'm going to start with the easy ones here in this housekeeping. If you ask a random person on the street, what do you think veganism is? 99% of them will say that it is about food. Food and diet is what they're going to say. Now let me get one thing straight here. Veganism has nothing to do with food because animals are not food. They are living creatures just like you or me. I'm not going to imply that you are food, right? I'm not going to refer to you as food. I'm not going to mistake you for being food because you're not food. You're a living being. If you think we're talking about food, then get your head straight. You're in a carnist paradigm where you think that farm animal equals food. What was that animal before? What was that lamb shank before it arrived on your plate, before it went through processing and was in the slaughterhouse? What was that lamb shank? That was a sensitive, innocent, living baby sheep, a lamb. A baby lamb. To refer to animals as food is to deny their experience prior to their death, right? And I understand that language can do this. Like, I can refer to someone who died 20 years ago as a corpse. I could say, they're a corpse now. But I wouldn't say that Anne Frank was a corpse who was alive between 1929 to 1941, or whatever the dates are. Sorry, Anne Frank, I got that wrong. But that would be insanely disrespectful if I were to refer to her as a corpse. It is denying who she was at her peak, at her prime, who she wanted to be. She wanted to be alive. She wanted to be a person. There are many parallels here with Anne Frank because she was treated like an animal. She was hunted like an animal, and she was disgracefully disrespected like an animal. She was imprisoned like an animal. She was tortured like an animal. She was executed like an animal. So what I say to people who start talking about food when the subject of veganism comes up is I offer them a choice. I say, do you want to talk about food or do you want to talk about veganism? We can talk about either, but they are not the same. Talking about food is not talking about veganism. Next one. Veganism has nothing to do with the environment. Say it with me. Veganism has nothing to do with the environment. Now let me explain why. The environmental catastrophe taking place right now was caused exclusively by humans and human-made decisions. The animals played no part in it. They are responsible for none of the environmental catastrophes unfolding right now on planet Earth. They are responsible for precisely zero of the methane emissions, carbon emissions. If you want to blame cows for methane emissions, blame the farmers who forcibly bred them into existence. When we involve animals in the environmental issues that humans have caused, it casts blame onto them. At least by inference. It makes it sound like animals are the problem, that they are a burden upon us. Reminds me a little bit of the Rudyard Kipling's incredibly racist poem called The White Man's Burden, where he was somehow able to reframe the colonies as the white man's burden. We're essentially doing that to animals when we are conflating environmental issues caused by humans with the animals. Environmentalism is already embraced by the mainstream as well. It is not a moral emergency. The majority of us, especially here in Europe, are all kind of on the same page about it. We have a selfish desire to reverse global warming. Let's get that straight. Here's an example. If I theoretically explained to you that you were funding a child trafficking and child murdering industry. Let's use human children just for you carnists out there who haven't opened their eyes yet. And through your lifestyle, you make purchases that perpetuate this child trafficking ring. Would it be appropriate of you to say, you know what, you're absolutely right. With eyes unclouded, you're absolutely right. I must stop engaging in that activity because those children are trafficked in diesel-fueled trucks, which are terrible for the environment. You see, it's not wrong what you're saying. There is an environmental component, but I would say get your fucking priorities straight. You are not seeing what is urgent about the situation properly. Okay, welfarism. Veganism is not about welfarism. There's a lot of welfarists here in the vegan movement, a huge amount. Veganism is not about welfarism. And I think the best analogy to explain this is the slave trade. One of the main defenses that was used on the pro-slavery side, when this was up for debate and there were these sides being taken of North and South in America and who was pro-slavery, who was against slavery, one of the main arguments on the pro-slavery side was the notion that African slaves are probably better off in terms of welfare than the freemen in the North, because you're typically going to treat property with more care than something that you rent. If you're thinking about a property of yours, a guitar, let's say, you're going to treat a guitar that you own better than a guitar that you rent, because that guitar stays with you, and if you damage that guitar, you're going to live with that damage. I mean, it's such an insidious argument. It's such a white supremacist argument, right? Because it's all from the oppressor's point of view and what benefits them. But it's also a welfarist point of view, you know? It's like, when we do consider it from the slaves in that argument, the slaves, it would be argued, are better off being owned rather than rented. Rented being free trade of labor, trading your labor for money. The question I ask is, how much is your freedom worth to you? Let's apply this situation to you. How much is your freedom worth to you? So let's make a deal here. What deal would you agree to where I could buy your freedom and you have to stay within this 100-meter radius? So in this example, I have like Jeff Bezos level money and I offer you this deal. Like, you can have whatever you want. I can arrange whatever you want for yourself, but for the rest of your life, you have to stay under house arrest in a 100-meter radius of my choosing. Is there anything I can offer you that would make you take that deal? Anything? See, I have a pretty good imagination, but still I can't imagine anything that would make me take that offer. And probably the same goes for you as well. The value of freedom. It is an intangible, crucial component in your life. And who are we to say that animals don't value their own freedom? We're animals. We can identify with animals. We can relate to animals. Animals share a lot of the same traits and the same values as us. And one value that is as basic as freedom, it's absurd for us to think that animals do not value freedom as the same kind of fundamental value that we do. So yeah, welfarists will typically fixate on suffering. That's their thing, you know, that's their shtick really, is suffering, reducing suffering, putting a blanket around someone who's cold. I get it. I would lie if I said that there weren't parts of me that relate to welfarism. But when it comes to the animals and our place in history right now, welfarism is just not appropriate for what we are dealing with. It's not. Abolition is appropriate for the situation that animals are dealing with here. The intense suffering does play a part in veganism. It is a component of veganism, and I will explain its place in veganism for you in as plain as simple a terms as I can. Suffering is an important component because it makes the problem urgent. That is a reason why, if you're a non-vegan, it is imperative that you evaluate your purchasing habits when it comes to animals today, right now, as soon as possible, and not some kind of time in the distant future. The intense levels of suffering that animals go through is what makes the situation urgent. The other reason why suffering is an important component behind rights and abolition is because suffering is a part of what makes animals eligible for rights. A being that doesn't have the capacity to suffer or never will have the potential to suffer, a being like that does not have the same eligibility for rights as a being who has the capacity to suffer. So really there's two reasons, okay? Those two reasons are why suffering is a component, but it should not be the main axis by which we assess our relationship with animals. I hope that makes sense. It gets a little bit complex, and I like to keep things simple on this channel, as simple as I can. And since we're talking about suffering, let's take the time now to differentiate rights-based veganism from utilitarianism. Because again, there are a lot of utilitarians in the vegan space that have really fucked up the definition of veganism for a lot of people and for the public. The public perception of veganism is either about food, the environment, welfarism, or if they're a philosophy graduate, it's something to do with utilitarianism. It's like an extension of utilitarian ideas. I don't know if I should completely dismantle it here. The way I like to look at utilitarianism is through the paradigm of law. So basically, human society has, for hundreds of years, built this very complex apparatus, which you could imagine as kind of like a Swiss watch, okay? It's very complex. It has a lot of additional parts. It's got a lot of moving parts. It's carefully balanced, carefully calibrated. It's built as a multi-tool for many complex situations. It has different clauses depending on certain things. It respects the rights of those who are going through the legal system. It has these specific, tailor-made things that can be applied to the most difficult and complex of situations. That is the human legal system that we have created over hundreds of years. And what utilitarianism does is it says, fuck that, don't even look at that, don't use any piece of that system over there that has been carefully calibrated and constructed. We're going to build a little clumsy sandcastle over here on the beach, and we're going to live and die by this little sandcastle that we've made in 5 minutes. I think that analogy is a better roast of utilitarianism than an hour-long, complex, point-by-point, like an epistemological critique of utilitarianism, which most people don't understand. The legal system by which we all benefit as human beings is built upon rights, deontological rights, and no utilitarian that I have ever come across has ever been adamant in wanting to dismantle the statute of human rights because they selfishly benefit from said rights. It is a human supremacist notion that animals should be treated with ruthless utilitarianism, but humans are better than that, and humans deserve rights. Humans deserve deontology. In veganism, utilitarians are the best when they are behaving like deontologists. When they are behaving like animal rights people, that's when they're on their best behavior. That's when everyone loves them, including the animals. When utilitarians start to get a little bit overzealous in their utilitarianism, and they start to follow utilitarian goals to their inevitable conclusions, when they start to disrespect or not go by a rights-based approach to things, that's when they start to resemble maniacs and crazy people and tyrants. The so-called vegans that built their little sandcastle and then put a little flag that says vegan in it, who built on a false notion that veganism is only about the reduction of suffering or the elimination of suffering, if you want to get really extreme. It starts to get really ugly really fast when they start talking about wild animal suffering. That's a Pandora's box. When they start making proposals to colonize Earth, when they start making proposals to violently overturn our status quo, that's when they lose most people. When their words really do have violent implications and they do a lot of damage. And I suggest that we shed those outdated ideas. I suggest that as vegans, we do this housekeeping where we nip this in the bud. When we identify someone as using utilitarian reasoning only, with no rights involved, when we see people bringing up the crop deaths argument, which is an entirely utilitarian misconception about veganism, I suggest that we nip this in the bud immediately and we reaffirm what veganism is, going by the original definition. This is housekeeping, people. This is how we consolidate and we are able to be taken seriously as a movement that is united under the same baseline principles, that we have no right to exploit animals for our gain, for our selfish gain, and that veganism is not environmentalism. It is not a diet. It is not welfarism. It is not utilitarianism. Veganism is veganism. So if you did have the question, should we bring animals into our legal system, I would say that would be great for animals. If animals were brought into our legal system, they would be protected under law, but not persecuted under law. Just like children. Because that is who they are when we have trait equivalency. They are children. Children are protected under law, not persecuted under law. I feel like this needs to be said with some of these utilitarians. They don't understand this. They don't grasp this for some reason. There you go. That's the end of my video. This is a bit of housekeeping for the vegans in here. I don't expect any non-vegans to be around at this point. If you're a vegan, keep fighting the good fight. Think about what I've just said here, and I think this will help your vegan outreaches. It will help your discourse around veganism. Yeah, I'll see you in the next video.
Hello, my name is Latifa Al Maktoum. My father is the Prime Minister of UAE and the ruler of Dubai, Mohammed bin Rashid Saeed Al Maktoum. And I'm making this video because it could be the last video I make. Pretty soon I'm going to be leaving somehow, and I'm not so sure of the outcome. And if you are watching this video, it's not such a good thing. Either I'm dead or I'm in a very, very, very bad situation.
32-year-old Princess Latifa is the daughter of Dubai's all-powerful ruler. She was born into a life of extreme wealth, but there was one thing her money couldn't buy: freedom. 4.5 months ago, with the help of a former French spy, she made a daring escape.
I could not believe the daughter of the ruler would want to escape.
To the outside world, Princess Latifa lived a privileged and carefree life in Dubai. Her best friend, Tina Jahanan, says she had a passion for skydiving in particular.
She basically had no freedom. She had curfews. Obviously, she could not have a normal life and say, for example, date a guy if she wanted to. Her life was just very restricted.
She hatched an extraordinary escape plan with her best friend Tina. It was equal parts Thelma and Louise and James Bond, at first fleeing by road to Oman, then by boat and jet ski to India, and finally flying to the United States, where the princess was going to seek political asylum. The reward was freedom at last. But if both women were caught, well, the consequences would be dire.
But she was willing to take the risk. She would often say, this is life or death for me. She was willing to take the risk, even if she would not make it.
Was she nervous or excited?
Actually, more excited than nervous, because she felt like she has nothing to lose.
Constantly on a tight leash, Latifa had to be smuggled out of Dubai in the boot of Tina's car. On the road to Oman, she stopped and completely changed her appearance.
As you can see, Latifa looks very excited. It's her first time sitting in the front seat in the car. Yes, ever. She's all used to having a driver and sitting on the back seat.
A 5-hour trip by dinghy and jet skis through high seas to international waters, where Hervé's yacht, the Nostromo, was waiting. The Runaway Princess's yacht was intercepted. Latifa was kidnapped by heavily armed soldiers and hasn't been seen since. What was the last image you have of Latifa?
She was kicking and screaming, and she was fighting for her life.
And you haven't seen Latifa since then?
No.